Welcome to this, which is the first UACES Spotlight event. So this is one of the newer activities that we're trying. In fact, it's the first time that we're trying it out, but it's really to give an opportunity to UACES members to share their work with an audience, to have that opportunity for discussion and debate around publications. And I'm really glad that we've got Marina joining us for today's discussion of her book, not least because I get a book in the post, which my wife is thrilled that I've got yet more things to stick on the bookshelf. Ideas and European Education Policy, 1973 to 2020, looks at education policy, the role of ideas. And Marina has recently published this. She's a lecturer in political economy at the Department of Government at the University of Essex, and also an associate lecturer at UCL. So her expertise and her interests have been in politics and political economy, and particularly the way in which actors shape public policies and the mechanisms by which ideas play a role in structuring and restructuring interests. And that's very much what this book is about. So the way this is going to work is we're going to start off with Marina's initial kind of presentation of some of the key ideas. And then I'm very grateful also to Michelle, who's joining us from Bristol, who's got some discussion points and topics. So we're going to let the two of them talk, but we're also really keen to get your input as well. So if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will come to them as we go along, and we'll go from there. But in the meantime, whilst you're listening, if you want to keep your microphones off, that would be much appreciated. I think that's all there is, except to say that I haven't introduced myself, I realise. I'm Simon Usherwood. I'm your chair, and I'm also the chair of UACES. And I'm not going to do much more because it's very much more to Marina.
Okay, so thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank Emily, Emma, and Melina, so the UACES team, for this opportunity. And I think it's a great way to support not only members, but also early career researchers like me. And many thanks to Simon as well for the availability to act as a double chair today. And then many thanks to Michelle, who I know since a long time, because she was my external examiner, and together with Claudio Radelli, she has endorsed the book. So thanks for being here and constant inspiration and mentor to me. So let me start by sharing the screen. Sorry. Here we are. Okay, so thank you so much. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will briefly present this book, the structure, and some key highlights and key takeaways before opening the floor for discussion. And at the end, there is a link provided by the publisher for a discount of 20% valid until July 2022. So let me start, first of all, by the motivation. So why this book? Well, what was the puzzle? Here, there are some little references to what is education policy today in Europe. And even though in this room, maybe you might not be all expert in education policy, you know about European studies. So you know very well that education is not a common European policy, but despite that, as you can see, many things are going on, and there is a sort of strong institutional configuration of this policy with an increasing role of the European Commission in coordination, in monitoring, in policies. There is this guy there, Xavier Prat-Monet, was former General Director of DG Education and Culture, saying that we cannot tell member states what to do, but we can tell them how they are doing and what they should do to improve their education system. So it's pretty interesting how education, always considered a strong domestic competence and very much linked to state identity has become somehow so Europeanized. So here the key question of the book is what explains this transformation? I mean, what's going on? What happened to education policy? Why we get here? So in short, this book basically explains the transformations occurred in the European education policy from 1973, which is the year in which we started to see a sort of formal role of the Commission in this policy until 2020. In particular, I focus in the book on two sets of transformation. One is the institutional configuration. So from being this gray area, now we're talking about a European education area with common framework, common tools, a common funding and so on. At the same time, there has also been a change in the policy orientation of education. So these supply side goals and a strong focus on goals such as economic competitiveness, growth, employability, at the expenses of other goals of education, such as education for personal development, inclusion, citizenship. So what the book does traces how this transformation change came about, how this common consensus around the goals of education was formed, which actors advocated it, and why it prevailed. And the main finding is that a specific problem definition of education as a solution to Europe's lack of competitiveness restructured the political landscape, empowering some set of actors, in particular the European Commission and the European transnational business. And in doing so, the book shows that there was a firm establishment and institutionalization of the European Union in education, despite the lack of a legal mandate. Indeed, the competencies of the Commission in education are exactly the same competencies foreseen by the Treaty of Maastricht of 1992, namely support and supplement the action of member states. However, as we have seen in the previous slide, there is much more than this. And the key concept is this education agenda constructed around this notion of the Europe of knowledge or knowledge economy, because even though I'm very aware that they have a very different meaning, at European level, they are used pretty in an interchangeable way. And most importantly, besides beyond this empirical case, what the book does tracks down the specific contribution of ideas in policy making. So my key aim is really to see ideas in action. How the book is structured? Well, the book basically applies an analytical approach to this temporal development of the events, so more than 50 years of education policy. And it does so by constructing this three-stage causal model that captures how ideas open new political spaces. And this model is indeed divided into three steps. So the first is the emergence of a problem definition that then corresponds empirically to the first decade, 73-85. Then there is the development in the political landscape. So how a problem of education defined in a specific way then moves policies, shapes coalitions, moves themes, venues, actors. And then the third stage is the institutionalization of this problem definition as policy solution. Obviously, applying this analytical approach requires a methodology like process tracing, which was in my case very important because it enabled me to distinguish the influence of ideas from the influence of other conditions like material interest or institutions. And in particular, here I followed this very nice chapter of Alan Jacobs on process tracing the role of ideas. I did follow three specific strategies. First, like a sort of archaeologist, I immersed myself in the historical archives of the European Union in Florence. So I had the opportunity to consult a lot of private and confidential documents. So also to understand whether the communication of the actors was consistent with their ideas or was simply strategic. Second, I did apply a sort of long-term horizon. So in this way, I could also see whether ideas remained constant despite variation in the material context. And then I traced the ideational origins and the role of ideas carriers. So in order to understand whether these changes in the policy outcome were preceded by the entry of the actors carrying these ideas. And this is the table of content of the book. So as you can notice, this three-stage framework then is applied to the different empirical events and developments of the European education agenda. I was mentioning this three-stage causal model, which I just want to illustrate very, very briefly, more than happy to discuss then in the conversation with Michelle and with you. As you notice, so we do have this pre-existing situation, and then when a new problem emerges, well, the new problem emerges under two specific conditions. First, there should be a change in the material condition. Of course, a change can be a shock, unemployment, a focal event, whatever changes what we are experiencing. And then we needed to have an ideational political entrepreneur that enters this political environment and then establishes this new problem definition. Then we have the second stage, which is the development. So basically, the problem definition, what it does, influences policy themes. So in my case, once education became defined as a problem of competitiveness, obviously actors dealing with competitiveness were more empowered in comparison to other actors. So in my case, business got ownership of the problem, whereas trade unions were rather marginalized. At the same time, if education was defined as a problem of European competitiveness, the venue shifts, changes. So from a national domestic venue, we go into a more supranational venue and so on. And obviously these policy entrepreneurs, whose assumptions are more aligned with the way in which the problem is defined, they not only take ownership, but also they propose their policy solutions with a mechanism of social constructions. Then we have the final stage, which derives from the previous two, but not completely. So here in the institutionalization, we do also have some strategic considerations. And here, for those of you familiar with the literature on ideas and Peter Hall conditions of economic, administrative, and political viability, the chosen policy solution wins if fulfills this condition. Then the final component of this model, as you notice on the left, is this alignment between the problem definition and the zeitgeist. So we can define the zeitgeist as the public mood, as the ideological assumptions of a specific moment in time, which increases or decreases the likelihood of specific ideas to enter the policy arena. Obviously, this model does not come out of the blue, but is a sort of, let's say, theoretical synthesis and theoretical effort combining different literature, given that my main interest was not the policy implementation, but was the policy formulation and the policy process. I went back to the theories on agenda setting, kingdom policy entrepreneurs, public policy analysis, framing, in particular the Diane Stone policy paradox, so the importance of rhetorical strategies in politics and so on. Now, moving on to the highlights of this book. What do we have? So first of all, the key finding is that the Europe of knowledge, so what started with the Lisbon strategy of 2000, was not really so much this watershed as considered by the majority of the literature, and did not appear out of the blue, but it was the result of an incremental, lengthy, and complex policy process that started in the mid-80s. In particular, we have in 1973-85, this is when we can detect a shift from a social to a more economic conception of education. That was the year 1985, in which we also had a sort of a first institutionalization of the European Commission with the first mobility programs. I'm sure you are all familiar with the Erasmus program that was precisely launched in 1985. And according to the theoretical framework, so we had this ideational leadership of Peter Sutherland, who was commissioner for education only for 8 months, but in these 8 months, he really emerged as this problem entrepreneur, leading and triggering change. in a zeitgeist which was, pretty Europhile. I mean, we were coming from the Eurosclerosis and all these, huge, you remember, the empty chair and all this crisis of the European Union. And then with the arrival of Jacques Delors and Adonnino Report, people of Europe, we were really in this period of strong integration from a cultural, political and economic point of view. Then we had the other decade, 1985, 1997. So the problem has emerged. Education is seen as the solution to all the problems of the time. And this is when it starts the so-called Discourse of Crisis. So basically the European Commission and the European business, through several publications and reports, they really advocated this story of fall and decline. So Europe is lagging behind US and Japan, they are doing better because they have amazing education system. So if we want to survive, we need to modernize our education system. How doing so? Well, by creating a very highly skilled workforce, mobile and able to answer to labor market needs. And a very interesting thing of this period is that the European business that in the book is identified with this big lobby of the European Roundtable of Industrialists, the European Roundtable of Industrialists, actually, they were the first one that advocated the creation of the open method of coordination and the creation of benchmarking and monitoring of member states' education system. And they were also the first one that clearly advocated that this task should have been entrusted to the European Commission. What was the zeitgeist at the time? Well, a much more, neoliberal zeitgeist, the 1992 project, the assumptions of the human capital approach. The book focuses a lot on the European Union and the European Commission. Obviously, there is a lot of influence of other international organizations, the OECD, that are not touched in the book, but were, part and parcel of this sort of, Copernican revolution in education. And then we have the third stage, which is 1997 and 2010, in which now this open method of coordination, despite a strong resistance of member states, because as I was mentioning before, member states never wanted to share competencies in education with the European Commission, never. I mean, it was a long and really complex process opposed at each step of this process by the same member states. At a certain point, and I will explain why, this idea, this problem definition becomes institutionalized with a clear link between education and European economic policies. And we are in a zeitgeist, we were in a zeitgeist, if you remember, of the famous third way. So education considered as a productive factor. You remember Tony Blair, right? Education, education, education. So it is in this zeitgeist that finally the knowledge economy gets institutionalized. The book has also this, let's say, exploratory chapter from 2010 until 2020, in which, I mean, I don't try to do predictions because we never do, no, as academics, but in which education seems now to be oscillating a bit between, this economic identity, these economic goals and European values. Also because we are in this zeitgeist now, I suppose, of the poly crisis. So we went through the migration crisis and the Brexit and the populism, and now we have COVID-19. Moving on the highlights regarding ideas, I think the key contribution here is to challenge the conceptualization of ideas as these monolithic blocks of meaning. So rather than inventing a new definition of what are ideas, I think that it would be better to focus on the function that ideas have in the policy process. So in this case, ideas can function as problem definition. Ideas can function as policy solution, so that's more the traditional policy paradigm view of Peter Hall, and ideas can also function as a zeitgeist. So ideas can also represent these key ideological and socioeconomic assumptions at a given moment in time. At the same time, a very long-standing debate in ideational scholarship is the question, okay, ideas, are they influential because they are pushed forward by powerful actors, so that's when ideas really matter, or there is also, something on their own? I mean, do ideas also have some sort of power and attributes that make them influential? And I lean obviously towards the second. So basically what I really try to emphasize in this book is this polysemy of ideas. So this ability of ideas of aggregating different preferences. So the polysemy as ambiguity of ideas as a sort of mechanism that enable actors to interpret their interests in a different way. That was basically the case of the knowledge economy or society interpreted as a knowledge economy, linked to economic growth, but also linked to social goals, but linked to citizenship, linked to social cohesion, to research, to innovation. Or if you remember in the Sorbonne Declaration, when the rectors said, well, Europe should not only be the Europe of the euro should also be the Europe of knowledge, so in a more sort of humanistic connotation. And this is also, I think, quite interesting because at the end it shows exactly the opposite of what the literature says, because consensus in this case and actors cooperation, rather than being a strategic and pragmatic and linear process, are a process of misunderstanding, right? Is a result of a misunderstanding exactly what is the knowledge economy, and precisely it is this ambiguity that then empowers policy entrepreneurs. Also, another key element of the book is this role of the problem entrepreneur, which I'm doing actually, we just submitted an article with Michelle trying to challenge a bit this notion of the policy entrepreneurs, saying that, okay, it is important to focus on the role of actors in selling their solutions to policy problems, but problems can also be framed. Problems are not just there and given for granted, but they can be easily framed in specific way. And how they are framed? Well, they are framed through the discourse and the rhetorical strategies. I mean, I do think that rhetoric is a very important component in political life. I mean, we have seen this with the Brexit. We have seen this with the Trump. So through different strategies like the naming and blaming. So the problem, lack of competitiveness, blaming, education, a solution, modernize education. We can also increase the chances of creating a policy change. What are the main key takeaways then? So first of all, as I was mentioning before, moving beyond this static conceptualization of ideas and also on the effects of ideas, because more than often in political science, the idea is there, is for granted, and we just examine the effect of the idea in the policy making. However, I think it's also important to understand and capture how problems are defined in the first place and what kind of implications. Then also another interesting thing is that ideas can also create entry or exit options. They can legitimize or not themes, venues, actors, institutions. So for example, as I was mentioning, in my case, once education became so much linked to competitiveness and employability, it was clear that trade unions, maybe advocating social inclusion, were much more marginalized in comparison to European business. Then, when ideas really influence policy choices, so that the story, my story of the knowledge economy, shows that ideas are more likely to have an influence when they frame a problem in a new terms, and also in terms that suggest a solution that can appeal to a different range of actors. That was the solution of the open method of coordination, so avoiding this harmonization, so this is sort of soft power, but without binding, without a binding role of the European Union, and the same with the knowledge economy. And problem definition really matters. There is, a chapter in the book, which is chapter 3, that I think clearly states how in the mid-80s, when we were into this, dramatic unemployment shock and technological change and all this shift from a Fordist to a post-Fordist society, on the beginning, education was intended as a social adjustment to this technological change. And then after a few months, education became intended as economic adjustment. So this tells that, to the same problem, we can also find a different solution, and we can also frame the problem in a completely different way. To conclude, the way forward and food for thought, well, looking at education, the final chapter of the book, the final section says, okay, are we going towards this new problem definition of education? We can see now, especially because of this, Euro crisis, not only Euro economic crisis, but, this crisis of Europe, this, identity crisis, we can see since 2015, this increasing recognition of this cultural and identitarian dimension of education, even though the economic one is still there, but we also see this as a sort of reinforcement of the soft power of the open method of coordination. So as I was saying, this chapter is really exploratory, but perhaps I can see also increasingly in the European Commission more and more communications and recommendations that look at the values of Europe, at identity, at education of democracy. A full cluster of Horizon 2020 is devoted to education and democracy. So this might be hints, perhaps, of a new course. And then really going beyond education, what is this case about? What is this case of? Well, I see education as a case of policy change in a European public policy characterized by ambiguity, high issue, and institutional complexity. If I ask each of you, what do you think is the purpose of education? Or what do you think, who do you think should be in charge of education? I'm sure I will receive so many different answers. So this also suggests that perhaps this three-stage causal model can be applied to similar cases and to similar ideas. For instance, I'm thinking about other polysemantic ideas like active aging in health policy, right? What does it mean exactly to age actively? Or sustainability or resilience. Now, I mean, with COVID-19, resilience is really a huge key word pushed forward by the Council of Europe. And I think I shall stop here and thank you for listening and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Marina, for that. I think it's a really good summary of the book, although, of course, obviously you'll want to rush out and actually still buy a copy using the codes. And I'm sure at some point, Marina, if you want to put the link and that discount code in the chat, people would appreciate that. But I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who is very familiar with the work for various reasons, and we're going to let the two of them have a chat.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to Marina for a very clear and coherent presentation, which I enjoyed very much. It's good to know that I think I have understood the book, so it tallies with what Marina was saying in her presentation. And I'm very happy to be here to comment and to ask some questions on what I consider to be an excellent piece of research. I'm going to say a few words and ask some questions to Marina about the book. Obviously, I didn't know what she was going to say in her presentation, and interestingly, she's covered a little bit of what I was going to ask about, but I think she can dig deeper into those topics that might already be a little bit familiar to us in the presentation. So by way of introduction, though, I could say that I think Marina mentioned this at the beginning of her talk, that I first met her in 2017 when I examined her PhD thesis at the LSE and have been working alongside her in a project in recent years. I've always been impressed by Marina's ability to juggle her teaching obligations alongside her research ambitions, and I think this is really not easy for early career researchers. So I just wanted to say many congratulations on the publication of your first book. It really is a great achievement, and you should be very proud of yourself. And you know, to add to that, alongside her book, which is definitely worth reading for its take on education policy and for its theoretical contribution, I'd also recommend you read some of Marina's articles as well, especially those in West European Politics 2021 and Journal of European Integration in the January 2022 issue. But it's the book that I've been asked to speak and question Marina about today. So I wasn't aware that Marina was going to say this at the end of her presentation, but I'm starting by saying, in essence, this is a book about policy change. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but I think sometimes going back to first principles is important. So it's about policy change, both theoretically and empirically. And policy change is a concept that's, well, it's frequently researched by academics, but it poses challenges for the researcher. What is policy change? Sometimes it's not clearly defined as a concept. And perhaps even more tricky is to explain policy change. We already have a number of theories to choose from. So those that aim for a more, let's say, holistic approach are the multiple streams framework, first proposed by John Kingdom, the advocacy coalition framework associated with the work of Paul Sabatier and colleagues, the punctuated equilibrium theory of Baumgartner and Jones, and not least the historical institutionalist framework such as Paul Pearson's path dependency approach. So those are approaches that are kind of multi-causal. They try to take this kind of broader holistic approach. A lot of research on policy change focuses on particular variables or factors such as interests, institutions, actors, values, learning and knowledge, to name but a few. And of course, we should not forget in that list ideas as well. And what I think the main contribution and value of Marina's work is that her framework fits with, in a sense, both bodies of literature. It's a book about ideas and the role of ideas in explaining policy change, but it's also holistic in the sense that it doesn't privilege ideas over other factors. And I think it's really interesting how Marina in her work looks at the interdependency between ideas and interests and institutions and actors and so on. So I think I would say that her work cuts across these two approaches, the kind of holistic approach and the approach that focuses on specific variables, even though on the surface the book is about the role of ideas. So I wanted just to flag that and say that, you know, focusing just on ideas, it doesn't even do justice to Marina's work. So this multifaceted approach, I think, is really interesting in its own right. But Marina's book is not just about the theory, it's also about the empirics, and can tell us a wealth of information about education policy and how it's evolved. And I think a second area of praise, which is what I'm in the business of doing at the moment, is, before I question Marina, is to say that I think the empirics are very rich in this study. So the book may be of interest to those who know very little about education policy and want to learn more about the role of ideas in explaining policy change, but it's also a book that can be read purely by those interested in education policy and wanting to know more about the policy itself, and of course by both of those two. So so I'd recommend the book both for its theoretical contribution and for its empirical contribution. And I think the two are equally weighted in the book, and it works very well together. So Marina's already summarized the key characteristics of the book, but I think it's worth restating what I consider to be the key elements of her project in my own words. So her book seeks to account for the transformation of European education policy at the time of the Lisbon Strategy and its subsequent development. Taking a long-term approach, the book explains the gradual reorientation of education policy towards the supply-side approach. And this the supply-side approach privileges economic growth, employment and competitiveness over other priorities. At the same time, the book also charts what might be termed the Europeanization of education policy over this period. This process taking the form of an enhanced role in the policy for the European Commission, based primarily on the open method of coordination. The role played by ideas is dissected, and I think that's important. It's really analysed using this three-step framework that Marina spelt out in her presentation. And that framework also serves as a periodization for the book, breaking the policy timeline into a first step, the emergence of the problem definition, a second step, the development of that problem definition, and subsequently a third step, the institutionalization of the problem definition. All of that I know Marina's discussed already, but I think it's worth restating. The research uses a process tracing methodology, drawing on interviews and a rich documentary and archival analysis, which Marina mentioned her use of the historical archives in Florence. So I consider the book a well executed and original piece of research, which is theoretically informed, contributes broadly to our understanding of the role that ideas can play in policy change, and makes a solid empirical contribution to the literature on education policy in Europe. So I've laid my cards on the table. I'm very positive about this book. This is not a hatchet job on the book, but I do have some questions that I'd like Marina to address. And so I'm going to open up the question part of this presentation, or the first part of the Q&A, by asking Marina a series of questions, one by one, or the sets of questions I'll ask one by one. And my first question, Marina, this is about the nature of policy change. It follows on from what I was saying about policy change being the kind of key contribution that you're making. At the start of the book, in the introduction, for example, you use the word transformation. This word appears several times in the book as we read through it. It's an element of the puzzle that you're trying to resolve. You know, how did this transformation come about? But I wondered how this term transformation, how this notion of transformation, how it relates to the process of change that you've identified, which is not a watershed moment, a big bang process, but an incremental and gradual process of change. Is there a contradiction here? Well, maybe not, but you could address that question. More generally, could you say a little bit more about the type of change you identify in the book? So what is the nature of the policy change you identify in the book? That's my first question. Marina.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the wonderful words and for all the compliments, also for promoting my work. So thanks so much. And thank you for this question. Let me go right to the question. You're right, because I think it's true. I mean, we know and we hear and we read so much about policy change, but I think, you know, we should also sometimes, you know, unpack a bit what exactly is a policy change, whether we are looking at a specific outcome, so that's policy change, or we are looking at a process, and that's also, you know, policy change. And in my case, it's true, I am really looking at not so much at an outcome. My outcome is just, you know, a little part of this book. All my focus is on understanding this policy process. And the way I see also this policy process, I think, is more, let's say, linked to this, you know, French tradition of, you know, the cognitive approaches to public policy. So to see the policy process as a domain of contestation, of a battle of ideas, of a battle between actors. And it is true that perhaps, you know, the term transformation might be misleading, because in reality, what I really wanted, you know, to understand was, you know, this input side of this policy formation. So the transformation is an effect, right? So is maybe you're right, I contradict myself, because the transformation is when something is already there. So perhaps I should have used, you know, the process of transformation to give, you know, the right weight, you know, to what I really want to do. And for me, the nature of policy change exactly is the process. And when I think about process, it's not only about actors and strategies and institutions, but it's really about, you know, the content. What exactly is changing? is I don't want to use a more, let's say, neo-Gramscian term as, you know, the social purpose of these changes, but that's also, you know, something that I think this book investigates, right? Because it's what really the social purpose of education in Europe is, you know, the highly skilled and cosmopolitan young person who is, you know, to tackle inequalities and disadvantages. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think that yes, I mean, my nature is also substantive. So it's not only the form of something and not only the effect, but is really, you know, the intermediate steps is about more on the mechanism. And you're right, it's absolutely, you know, incremental and gradual, because even my conception of ideas is gradual. One idea is not formed there. It depends on the kind of meaning that you want to give to this. I mean, there is, I think, in the book, a pretty clear discussion on how the knowledge economy was intended in the 90s. So under, you know, this neoliberal umbrella, so the knowledge economy had a strong neoliberal significance. When Edith Cresson published the report, you know, towards the Europe of knowledge, I mean, there was a contestation from everyone. Member states said, oh, that's a very utilitaristic conception of education. The council, the COREPER said the same. The economic and social committees said the same. So there was this, let's say, monosemantic meaning of the knowledge economy, very much utilitaristic and very much, you know, oriented towards the supply side, and that's it. And then when this knowledge economy became polysemantic, so became misunderstood, became all and nothing, that's when, you know, the idea won. So I think this also tells you that the nature of the policy change, which is really incremental, is complex, is lengthy, and it takes time, because I don't know, now make an example, it's very difficult in a journal article not to give idea of a process, because, you know, you really have to write a lot. I mean, look at me, I just wanted to explain something in the 2000, and I had to go back in the mid-70s, and otherwise I would not have been, you know, credible to myself and to everyone. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's yes. Yeah.
Yeah, you did. Thank you, Marina. I think one of the strengths of the book is that you take this long-term kind of historical even perspective and start in 1973, because I think that really adds to the understanding of the policy. And I think if you had simply looked at the proposal for the Lisbon strategy and started at that point, you know, at the kind of agenda setting point for the Lisbon strategy, I think we would have lost a lot of the nuance in the book. Understandably, that you know, your focus is on the role of ideas, and I think that's where you make a big contribution. So I'm kind of interested. You already spoke eloquently about the role that ideas play in policy making, and how you unpack what an idea is, and how problem definitions emerge, and so on. But I wondered if you could comment. I mean, there might be those in the audience who are aware of the ideational approaches that became kind of fashionable in the 1990s. And you refer to this literature, the books of Craig Parsons, for example, Sherry Berman, who wrote about the role of ideas. I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that literature. I mean, I know that you know it well, and comment on why you feel that it's necessary to revisit and move beyond that literature. Is it that these authors misunderstood the role that ideas play? Is it that you're doing something different to those authors? You're making a different kind of contribution? So my question is, what is it that you're contributing to the literature different to those who wrote about the role of ideas, say, in the 1990s or early 2000s?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Michelle, I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, on the one side, you know, I'm really grateful to literature about ideas on the 90s, because before that, if you were studying ideas, everyone was telling you, okay, ideas are interesting in disguise, right? What are ideas? So I think an important contribution of that literature, I mean, starting with Peter Hall and Berman and Goldstein and Cohen, was really, to bring back again ideas in the analysis. But at the time, I think that the key question of the scholarship of all of us was, okay, do ideas matter? And I think that, this literature was extremely important to understand that indeed ideas matter. And what they did, again, very importantly, was to demonstrate that ideas matter when there is a moment of crisis, when there is a shock, when there is, Mark Blyth, the Knightian uncertainty. And that was already, a step forward in comparison, to the usual rationalist/positivist comments, right, about ideas. And now I think that, we are moving on, and this is what also the issue of, the special issue of West European politics was. We are moving on a bit on from do ideas matter? Yes, we know exactly that they matter. And now I think the question is, how do they matter? So how do they matter? Which does not mean, to establish a hierarchy, which was, I think, one of the biggest mistakes that, ideational scholarship wanted to do. It's not really, that, something comes first and second and third, but it's really what was perhaps one of the points of my last slide, right? How ideas intervene with actors. So how do ideas empower specific actors over others? So how do ideas empower specific institutions over others? So how do ideas in reality, act as autonomous causes, meaning, they still interact with interest and institution-based determinants, but they can also have an influence on their own. And for example, I mean, in the final chapter on the Lisbon strategy, on the third way, when this knowledge economy finally came about and became polysemantic, it's very difficult, to find a single actor that really pushed forward these ideas, right? It was Maria Joao Rodriguez, then it was Giddens, then it was, Blair, then it was Esping Andersen, and then it was Maurizio Ferreira. So there is clearly something there on this, attribute of the idea itself. So I think, and that was the first thing. And then the second thing of this literature was always, again, on the effect of the idea in the policy making, but how this idea originates, how this idea, what is exactly the trajectory when it starts, which I think means, and what I really want to do and what I think this new literature is trying to do is, to provide this more fine-grained analysis of the macro foundations of ideas. So from where they come from, why they are successful, not only when there is a shock, because take the idea of resilience, right, in COVID-19, of course it's successful, or the idea of austerity during the Euro crisis, Some ideas are really successful because, we are lost and we need some certainty in the uncertainty. But there are other ideas that really, work on the back, slowly, and gradually, and then they are adjusted, adapted, and readjusted, and readapted, until, they stick, and they are resilient forever. So, I mean, I'm really grateful for all this literature, but still, this literature of the 90s is think about, Peter Hall, the policy paradigm, right? The policy paradigm tells you, what to do and how to do, but it never tells, who is in charge of doing something. And I think, trying to, let's say, combine and merge a bit more, ideas and agency. So the agency of ideas rather than the agency of actors. This is something that, we should all, continue to do, even though it's very challenging, it's difficult, and it's time consuming, and it's not easy. But if we really want to better understand ideas, I think we should stop a bit to look at the effect and focus a bit more, on this trajectory.
Thank you, Marina. I think that's very clear, and I think it's the points are well taken. And I think, I would reiterate again my view that your main contribution in this book is on the literature, on the role of ideas, and the book, from that perspective, this is a book that's not just for people interested in education policy, but interested in policy making more generally. Ideas are central. Institutionalization also matters in your study. And in a sense, you have these two arguments, one about the Europe of knowledge and the problem definition and the emergence of the idea of the Europe of knowledge, or the knowledge economy, whichever phrase we use. But at the same time, you have an argument which kind of runs alongside it around the role of the Commission. And I wondered whether, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here a little bit, so I wondered whether you aren't overstating the role of the Commission in the new, well, new, it's not that new anymore, but the new education policy. So you talk about the coordinative role of the Commission. Why do you find the Commission's role so impressive that it forms part of a core argument in your work? How much does the Commission really matter in education policy?
Okay, so thank you so much. Yes, well, it's true. This was something that there was especially in the beginning of my PhD at the LSE, I was always accused, right? I mean, how do you think that the Commission is so important? And this also relates to the, let's say, personal motivation for this book, because before starting my PhD, I was a civil servant for the Italian Ministry of Education, and I was also working for the SEDEFOP, like this agency of vocational training, and it was already the period in which the problem definition was institutionalized, right? So what we had to do as a civil servants, we were receiving all these, templates and the country reports from the Commission, and we had, to fill in these templates and these reports. And I remember I was always thinking, I mean, okay, there was, I don't know, the subsection, okay, how lifelong learning in your country is improving skills. And I remember I was always thinking, okay, why cannot talk about lifelong learning improving social inclusion? That was, the first time in my mind, I said, there is something going on with this open method of coordination. I did participate, to so many meetings and working groups with all these, country experts that meet in Brussels and exchange peer learning activities and so on. So I could tell that, on the side of the Commission, there is this sort of, I don't want to say the word moral authority or moral leadership, but there is something. It looks like that, they know better what's going on, and they know better, what is better for you in your member states. It is true that, when we think about education policy, we always think about just the ministry, but it's not that. There is, so much stuff around and so many people around working on this. I'm not sure, I'm overstating the role of the Commission, but surely, especially now, and especially given, the huge amount of funding that the Commission, gives to education policy under several streams, and especially given the fact that the Commission sets the priorities. It is true that the Council is important, but more than often, these priorities are there, given by the Commission. And you just have, you go to your minister and you say, okay, this year we just have to implement these 3 priorities. And, it's a sort of subtle and, gradual and incremental and soft influence, but there is something. And now all this influence is institutionalized, because if you take all these, working groups around the European education area, and you have hundreds of civil servants and stakeholders and experts and academics that, they work together, but they work together on a specific problem definition, on a specific priority. They don't, decide what to do. So that's why I think that, the role of the Commission in European education policy is really, really important. And it is true, it's a soft governance and is not, binding or whatever, but this does not mean that they are not influencing education policies, especially now that, everything is really so anchored to the annual growth and stability pact and, all the recovery fund, all of these funds, they do mention education, and you will get some funding if you do specific kind of reforms. Otherwise, you will not. So it's very hard to say, because these things are not really official. They are not formalized. But yeah. So I'm not sure it's overstating, but there is surely this soft power, which I would be interested in investigating more. Like the book, for example, does not really focus so much on the role of specific member states, right? The reaction to this agenda, or how they influence this agenda. I mean, surely Sweden with Larsen, right? They had an amazing influence on this education agenda, or other countries. So perhaps that's food for thought. Like, is the Commission overstated or not? But yeah, not sure I answered, but I did my best. Are you there, Michelle? Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. That's great.
Yeah.
Hello? Can you?
Yeah.
So I have a final question, which is more in line with one of the final slides that you showed, which is where to next in European education policy. Whether it's the policy itself or research in the policy. You already mentioned a couple of strands of interesting research that could be pursued in the future. Where do you see the gaps in our understanding of the policy? How do you think researchers should engage with European education policy in the future?
Yeah, I think that perhaps, what we really don't know. I mean, my book mentioned a bit, but not so much, because again, it's very difficult to study, is, what is really the role of non-state actors, and what about, the transnational governance of this policy. I mean, I did mention a bit the role of the European Roundtable of Industrialists, but I think it would be very interesting to better unpack the role of European business in education policy. The same for European trade unions. We don't really know so much the role of European trade unions in education policy. Sometimes, I also did try, for example, in my PhD, to have access to the archives of the European Roundtable of Industrialists, and they denied me this access. So sometimes it's also very difficult to access documents and material. The same for, the European Trade Union Confederation. If you want to study at their archives, you have to tell them, 1 year in advance what you're looking for, which is something, impossible to do, because that's not how it works, archival research. So I think, there is, I think, now a good strand of research that looks at the role of non-state actors. I think, about, Cohn and Brogger, they're really looking at this, sort of privatization trend. Also, Sototero did some work about this, but I think that would be the most interesting, research to do. What about the non-state actors? I mean, how did they influence the agenda or not? So, basically moving beyond this dichotomy, Commission member states, and engaging a bit more with other actors, as education is populated by so many actors. So we really don't know so much about that.
Thank you, Marina. That's really clear. I'm going to hand over. So you've answered all my questions really well, so thank you for that. I'm going to hand back to Simon, I think, who's going to search out some questions from the audience.
Yes, that's certainly the plan. Thank you very much, Michelle, for the questions and for the responses from you, Marina. Again, if people have questions they'd like to ask, either put your hand up or stick it in the chat. We haven't got anything yet, so I'm going to use my position as chair just to kind of think about a couple of other dimensions that occurred from reading the book and from listening to you today. And one is just this kind of element of process tracing that you do in the book, and thinking about that as a methodology. And one of the things that I often encounter with my students when I'm teaching about process tracing is this kind of anxiety that everything is connected to everything else, and that every idea stretches back to the dawn of civilization, and how do you draw the lines on that? So I'd be really interesting to kind of get your practical tips about how one makes this kind of methodology work. Where do you draw the lines? What do you look for? How do you keep this a manageable piece of data collection while still been able to generate meaningful research conclusions.
Okay, so thank you. It's true, Simon. I mean, process tracing is it's very challenging. It's very time consuming, and it depends, you know, exactly what you're trying to trace. I mean, very briefly, process tracing is okay. I have a condition, I have an outcome, and I have A, B, and I want to know what is in between. Oh my God, how do I do? What I did in my PhD was two things. First, I attended a summer school on advanced process tracing. So I really recommend it to everyone. I was lucky because, you know, my previous degree is in history. So somehow, you know, I know how to handle a huge amount of documents. But what I did in my case is, first of all, you know, okay, let's take an example. Let's take, you know, the stage of my causal mechanism, the emergence of a problem definition. Okay, so I want to understand how the problem of education as a problem of competitiveness emerged. So first of all, what do? You need to conceptualize your mechanism. So you need to specify the mechanism based from the theory. Or what do you know, your explanation, and so on. Once you conceptualize your mechanism, then you operationalize. So basically, you let's say, develop these case-specific observable implications derived from the theory. Once you do this, once you operationalize, you basically collect the observations. So you go into the empirical evidence, the empirical material. You gather all this evidence. And then there is a step 4. Basically, you do, there is, you know, this very nice article of Pagliarello, you know, about Sherlock Holmes and the different sort of strategy. You assess the weight of evidence. So basically, you need to make sure that the mechanism really exists and you are not inventing it, or you need to make sure that, you know, the evidence supports your prediction and so on. Now, to make you an example, okay, the stage of emergence of the problem definition. Conceptualize the mechanism. In this case, I expected, okay, to see an ideational political entrepreneur acting as main agent of change. And you conceptualize this based on theories. So in this case, I don't know, Kingdon and Dahl and Mintrom, Vergari, and so on. Then basically you do the observable implications, right? So you say, okay, a policy entrepreneur can be identified as this ideational political entrepreneur when, and again from the theory you conceptualize it and you say, okay, if he has a specific ideas working as a roadmap, if he has a political and personal resources, team building, social equity, persistency, right? What we know from the literature of policy entrepreneurs has the ability to exploit a window of opportunity. So you conceptualize this mechanism as abstract as possible. Otherwise, you know, you will be very biased using theories. Once you have conceptualized this, then what do? You collect observations. So basically, in the archival documents, you need to see what you have predicted because of the theory. So you do, I don't know, you check private documents, you do interviews, public documents, official documents, and so on. So if my mechanism is right, what I have to see in the archives in Florence? I have to see an individual, okay, which is very well placed in the European arena, that has specific ideas about education, that is able to persuade and communicate these ideas effectively. He needs to have persistency, he needs to have, you know, a huge team, and he needs to be able to exploit a focusing event. So that's what I did. And then I looked and I said, okay, at the time, you know, I had these 12 years and 4 commissioners, so starting from Dahrendorf, then there was this Guido, I don't remember the name, then there was, you know, Ivor Richard, and then there was Peter Sutherland. So one by one, I found Peter Sutherland because Peter Sutherland was an individual well placed in the European arena. He had political and personal resources. He had persistency. Ralph Dahrendorf had no persistency. Ivor Richard was, oh my God, no, education is member states. I don't want to know nothing. Peter Sutherland was someone saying, you know what, there is a room in the treaty for expanding the competencies in education. So that's how you do, basically. You conceptualize this mechanism as abstract as possible. Then you look for the evidence, and then you see if these predicted parts of the mechanism match the evidence. Did I answer your question?
You did. I mean, it still sounds like a lot of work, which I think is, you know, is always the challenge. You know, it is that difficulty about, you know, the conceptualization, and then you still have to go and find those things and see if they work for your anticipated model. So yeah, I think, you know, there's it is a process which you know, a methodology which I think has a lot of great potential in it, but again, it's that operationalization that I think often can seem quite daunting. And that kind of leads into a second question, which is thinking about other areas where this can be applied. And you mentioned that in your opening comments, thinking about other concepts where this might work. You know, when you mentioned resilience, that was certainly one of the examples that I was thinking about as being, you know, another area where we have this kind of term that has emerged relatively quickly and, you know, has seemed to have taken root in the system of governance quite broadly. So just, you know, for you, you had quite modest limits for where you saw this being able to be used elsewhere. And I'm just kind of curious as to why you have modest ambitions for where this can be used, or, you know, is that intrinsic to the ideas? Is it intrinsic to the domains, you know, or is it actually just you're just being modest? You know, could we use it for everything?
Well, no, to be honest, I mean, what I suggest and what, you know, maybe I will do in the future also to see if this model holds. When I say, okay, I think this model is better fit for policy areas that are, you know, with this high issue and institutional complexity, is because I think, you know, this is where you can really perhaps, you know, capture better the role of ideas. And public policies are, you know, full of so many different ideas. Even in terms of ideas, I mean, sometimes I think, you know, about so many ideas that, you know, like even the idea of the student experience, for instance, right? I mean, we are all academics or students. So exactly what does it mean, the student experience? I see this idea, you know, so much polysemantic, and there will be so much interested in understanding, you know, when did it emerge and who really, you know, pushed it, and then how this idea developed, who was empowered with the idea of the student experience, who was marginalized, and then how it got institutionalized. So no, to be honest, I really see that, you know, this three-stage model can really be applicable to so many policy fields, but also level. I mean, in my case, I use it at the European Union, but it can easily be done at local level or national or regional, or and even with ideas. I mean, I put active aging because I'm very fascinated by, you know, the idea of active aging, because I really think that, you know, it puts the blame on the people if they get sick, right? Because they don't age actively. But the idea of social inclusion or social investment, which, you know, is another, you know, so much I could be separated, right? I can just apply the emergence, no, or the development or the institutionalization. So I do like this model because I think it's pretty flexible as well, you know, to be adapted and translated. So I don't want to sell myself too much, but but yes. And Simon, I missed it before because basically all my hardware fall down. But regarding process tracing, I wanted to add that yes, you are right, and I think, you know, what if I had a student, you know, telling me I want to do process tracing, even though I am like a super qualitative person, and, you know, I am an historian, so it's really my methodology. I think that one thing is what is called, in Bayesian logic, like the confidence. And this confidence is the prior knowledge. You need to know a bit your case. In my case, I knew somehow that something happened in the mid-80s because I was working in education policies for 20 years. So I knew that, something was going on. Or I knew that, there was something about the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which I encountered, the first time in 2005 when I was working for Cedefop. So process tracing, I think, also requires, some sort of, prior knowledge, which can be given by the literature, but also by, personal experience, professional, and so on. But I think now, much more than before, now, process tracing is trying to open itself to all these, quantitative analysis. And I think Bayesian analysis, which is something I don't understand, but I see a lot of political scientists now converting a bit to process tracing and doing Bayesian analysis. So depending on what kind of students you have, I think it can be done. I mean, it is possible.
It's certainly possible. I think it's just, as you say, it's that investment in your case that matters. And, I'm thinking about my own research about Brexit. One of the challenges is that we certainly have the polysemic meanings of what Brexit is or should be, but we don't have any kind of crystallization about, an agreement. We have a term which remains fundamentally polysemic, and because we don't have any kind of crystallization of action around that, we end up with this kind of very indeterminate kind of mess that's there. So maybe in 20 years' time, I'll be able to tell you how these ideas emerged. But just put in that way, it is that kind of idea that at some point a narrative or a frame emerges, which then becomes very powerful in organizing and establishing, as you say, what the problem is, and therefore what the solution might be. I'm just checking to see if we've got any questions yet. I'm not sure that we do, but I don't know if there's anything, Michelle, you'd like to add at this point as the last kind of comment, thought?
Not particularly. I just think, Marina's work should be read at different levels. I mean, I agree with you, Simon, that the process tracing elements is really kind of interesting in the way that Marina's operationalized it in the book, but scary as well in terms of how much research she did. And I think it's it shouldn't surprise anyone that this comes from a PhD project, multi-year PhD project of long-standing, and plus additional work post PhD as well. So it is not something to be done in the space of a year or two. But as a final comment, I don't have any more questions. But as a final comment, I'd just like to say thank you to Marina for this opportunity to comment on her book, and which I enjoyed reading very much. And I'm still dipping into and going back to some of the chapters. Chapter 3, for example, which I liked and enjoyed reading. My questions were not intended to undermine anything in the book. It's just to provide a vehicle for Marina to explain some of the elements that go into the book. And I think if we just focus on the role of ideas, we're missing a trick with this book, because it's very rich theoretically, but also empirically as well.
It's very true. Massimo, you appeared and then you disappeared. You got a question?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be very quick. Thank you, Marina, for your presentation. It was really, really enjoyable. Probably I will lower a bit the level of the quality of the questions before. I'm Massimo D'Angelo. I'm a PhD student at Loughborough University, London. And I'm very far from your topic. I didn't know very much about education, but I'm studying negotiations to access the European Union. So somehow I'm very interested also, because I would love to use process tracing to study the negotiations between the European Union and candidate countries. And so I had basically three quick questions. But first of all, I also agree with you, probably, Marina, that there is this growing trend now looking at an interpretivist approach to causal mechanism. I'm thinking of Ludwig Norman. There are some nice recent papers looking at that. So my first question was this, because for me right now it represents the biggest struggle, how to deal with the allegation that probably process tracing may result in a too positivist approach, and how have you, if you have ever coped with this criticism? Because for me now it represented at this stage of my PhD the biggest challenge, how to deal with this. And then my second question was a very practical one. How did you use, if you could just a bit more unpack what kind of data have you looked at? You mentioned the archival sources, but I think that in Florence, in Fiesole, they only stopped in 1970s. So how did you deal with the more recent documents? And if you have used, for example, like some public discourses, if you have used discourse analysis, something like that. So if you could just briefly unpack a bit this. But thank you very much, because it was very, for me that I didn't know very much about the topic, was very clear and brilliant presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Massimo, for your questions. So, and the compliments. So regarding the first question, again, it depends. You know, process tracing is really a big word. Even on the definition of process tracing, I think you will find something like 37 definitions. So I think that is not really that process tracing comes to you, but you come to process tracing. So I think you just have to find, you know, your way of doing it, and you can absolutely, you know, do something which is valid and solid and reliable just with the documentary analysis. I mean, we were mentioning Bayesian analysis, but there are many other ways of doing process tracing. As far as, you know, you don't cherry pick your evidence. I mean, that's basically the thing. I think you always have to go with this, which we all have as academics, right? With this, you know, inquiry mind, like, okay, what should I find if I am wrong? And you have to look for this. Or what should I find if I am right? You have to look for both. And then maybe another thing important with process tracing, which, okay, something, you know, historians might be very irritated, but is the role of counterfactual, right? So what would have happened without, you know, Peter Sutherland? Maybe nothing. So counterfactual, I think, is a very good way to, how to say, to cope with the positivist. I mean, that at least was my way when I was, you know, presenting a process tracing in a very positivist department like mine. So I know what you mean. Regarding the data, I mean, I was really very much interested in the period, you know, starting with the mid-70s until the mid-90s. So I really didn't need to look, you know, confidential documents after the 90s, because that was the stage of the institutionalization, right? So everything was already there. I just had to do documentary analysis. Regarding the sources of the archives, I got, you know, a lot of, let's say, derogations for many of them, because many of them were closed, but I got, you know, the permission to look at them. You know, there were days that I was just there examining thousands of documents and finding nothing. And then, as you will learn in process tracing, there is, you know, the minute in which you find your smoking gun. I never went with, you know, public speeches, because that is, you know, the suggestion when doing ideas, you know, that the more confidential and the more informal is a document, the better it is. Otherwise, you will never find out if a speech is strategic or is really not genuine. So I only went with confidential documents. And I was, I have to say, very lucky, because I met these former high official of the DG Education and Culture, which was Highwell Seri Jones, who worked at the Commission for 30 years. And then when he finished working there, all his private documents were moved to his big house in Cardiff. And basically he invited me there, and for like 7 days, I was like, you know, just checking documents. So all the time, and all of these were like confidential and private. So that was my research. I didn't do any kind of discourse analysis because, as I said, you know, being an historian, I prefer, you know, the normal Tucidide sort of methodology. But yes, that's what I did. I mean, it took really a lot, but as I was mentioning, I was already working in the field. So more or less, I knew what happened, but I knew what to look at, even though, you know, some days were absolutely, you know, waste of time because I was finding nothing. And you have to carry like these big folders, you know, like weighing 10 kilos, and then you have to bring them back. And then, you know, the next day with others. So it's really time consuming, but it can be very, very rewarding, depending, you know, if you find your smoking gun. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massimo, and thank you to Marina and to Michelle for everything that they've presented today and discussed today. Again, I think it's a really good book. I'm going to wave it again since I've got a copy. For those of you who don't have a copy to wave around, again, there is that link in the chat, and if you're watching this later, you're not sure or you can't see the link, then I'm sure if you email Marina, she'll be more than happy to share that link with you. Again, if you're watching, if you've got a book that's coming out or that has come out and you'd like to do one of these spotlight events, we're more than happy to help arrange that for you. Just drop a line to UACES. If you go to the website at uaces.org, then there's contact information for the office, and we will whip that up for you because it's, I think, a really good opportunity to not simply publish a book and then not have the opportunity to reflect and expand and share on all that work and effort. And I think particularly in this case, as Michelle says, there's an awful lot there, and it's work of an academic lifetime, but there's much more still to come, I'm sure. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you to all of you who've been watching, but particularly to Michelle for her questions and her input, and especially to Marina for what's a really great read and well worth your time. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Simon, Michelle, Emily, Emma. Now I am with my phone, so I don't know who is there, but
we've got various people there, but yeah, again, with the technology, we can always make it work in the end. Okay. So have a great evening, and we will see you all at another UACES event, I hope.